Welcome to the deep dive. Our job here is to take a big stack of sources, articles, research, notes, you name it, and really boil them down, pull out the most powerful, actionable stuff, basically giving you the shortcut to being genuinely well-informed. And today, well, we're diving deep into the hidden dynamics of real estate success.
That's right. If you just look at the surface of real estate, you see the deals, the mortgages, the closing costs, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But the people who are really successful, they're operating on a different level, a deeper one. So our mission today is to kind of pull together these fields that seem pretty separate, things like personal discipline, high finance, even behavioral psychology, and historical sociology, to show you the whole playbook for getting that professional edge. We're really looking for the deep context around housing, way beyond just the list price.
Yeah, and the sources we've pulled together for this one are fantastic. I mean, we're going from the tiny details of habit formation, that 1% rule, straight into these huge lessons from, like, the subprime bond market mess.
Right.
And then landing right in the uncomfortable truths about historical discrimination that, still shape our cities today. It's definitely an eclectic mix, but that's usually where the best insights come from, isn't it?
Absolutely. And the core idea, the thing we really hope you take away is this: real lasting success in real estate. It demands that you master three key areas. You've got the technical side, the mechanics, the finance. Then there's the human element, so sales, psychology. And finally, that systemic context, the history, the external forces. And the knowledge, well, it has to be absorbed, understood, and then applied right away, consistently and, thoughtfully, #TagNGIA. The mindset and systems of the successful real estate professional.
Okay, so let's start with the engine behind it all, right? The individual professional, their daily operating system. We're always chasing these massive breakthroughs, these big actions, but the research, it seems to suggest that huge success is almost always built on tiny, tiny, consistent improvements.
It's exactly that. It's like compound interest, but for behavior. And the math here, it's not just motivational talk, it's actually predictive. Think about this. If you manage to get just 1% better at some key task, maybe it's your follow-up process or how you do due diligence or even researching for negotiations.
Right.
If you do that 1% better each day for a whole year, by the end of the year, you are literally 37 times better.
37 times? That's staggering.
It is. But because the daily change is so small, it's almost invisible, right? So most people just dismiss it. They don't see the power accumulating.
And you have to look at the flip side, too, which is just as powerful, maybe even scary if you let yourself slip, just 1% worse each day.
Yeah.
Well, over that same year, you pretty much decline down to almost nothing.
Exactly.
It really proves that most careers, they aren't defined by these big dramatic moments, but by the relentless, sometimes kind of boring accumulation of all those small decisions you make every single day.
And that daily path, it fundamentally changes who you are. This may be the most powerful idea from this whole area of study. Effective change shouldn't really focus on the outcomes like, I want 5 new listings this month. It should focus on your identity. Your habits, they're like the physical channels, the way you actually bring your deepest beliefs about yourself into reality. So every time you show up and do that habit, you're basically casting a vote for the kind of person you want to become.
Okay. So you literally become your habit.
You literally become your habits. And that means the focus has to be internal first. It's about who you want to be. Do you want to be a disciplined, proactive investor? Or someone who just kind of waits around for the market to tell them what to do? #HEA.
The power of small, consistent improvements, identity change. Okay. Let's unpack that 37x thing a bit more. Give us a real-world example, maybe something relevant for, like, a real estate agent. If a really disciplined agent decides, okay, I'm going to spend an extra 15 minutes every morning just researching market comps in one specific little neighborhood, what does that actually look like after a year?
Well, that tiny habit, that 15 minutes, it transforms them. They go from being an agent who uses, the general MLS data, to someone who has this incredibly granular, hyperlocal intelligence. They've cast hundreds of these little votes, affirming, yeah, I am the expert in this neighborhood. So when they walk into a listing presentation, they don't just know the average price per square foot. They know why that house on lot 4B sold for 10% less than 4A next door.
Like maybe there was a specific easement or some zoning quirk.
Exactly. Stuff the average agent completely missed. So that 1% improvement, it's not about working 37 times harder. It's about the quality of their information, their reputation, compounding over time.
And the change, it has to start small enough that you can actually stick with it, right? Like trying to jump from making 0 lead calls to 50 a day. That's just setting yourself up for failure because it's too big a shock to your current identity.
Precisely. You're building systems, not just setting goals. The system is the process you follow, and the goal is just the result. If your system is solid, the results, they pretty much take care of themselves.
Right.
So by focusing on that identity shift, I'm the kind of person who doesn't go to bed with unread emails in my high priority folder. The outcome, having a clean inbox, it becomes almost automatic. It's a byproduct of who you are. Hashtag BB, establishing good habits and breaking bad ones.
Right.
So once you've kind of defined that person you want to be, that identity, we can use these 4 laws of behavior change to sort of engineer your environment around it. The framework is basically 1, make it obvious, 2, make it attractive, 3, make it easy, and 4, make it satisfying.
Okay, make it obvious. Sounds simple enough. But, in the craziness of a real estate professional's day, that often seems like the first thing to go out the window. How do you make sure the important stuff doesn't get buried by the urgent but, less critical tasks?
Yeah, that's a great point. We use something called implementation intentions. So instead of just vaguely saying, oh, I'll research financing options later, you get really specific. You say, at 9 a.m., right after I finish my first coffee, I will open the 5 specific bank websites I need to review, and I'll do it in my home office.
Okay, so you're tying it to existing cues, the time, the place, the coffee.
Exactly. You make the cue for the good habit so obvious, so clear, that it's almost impossible to avoid.
And then make it easy. That feels like the most practical one, maybe, because it just acknowledges that, well, we're all kind of lazy, right? We naturally take the path of least resistance.
Yes, and that's where you can actually weaponize friction. You want to engineer things so the good habit is the easiest path, and the bad habit involves the most friction, the most effort. The classic example you see in the sources is dealing with, like, mindless TV watching. If you actually unplug the TV, or maybe even just take the batteries out of the remote every time you finish using it.
Oh, interesting.
That little bit of extra effort, maybe 10, 15 seconds, that small amount of friction is often just enough to interrupt that automatic mindless impulse to just flop down and watch whatever's on.
Is it really just 10 seconds of friction, though? That seems almost too simple to beat a really ingrained bad habit.
Well, the genius of it is that it stops the decision from ever really reaching your conscious brain, your system 2 thinking. Bad habits often run on system 1, that instant automatic reaction. By adding that friction, you force a pause. Just long enough for system 2 to kick in and ask, wait a second, is this really how I want to spend my time right now? And importantly, when you're breaking a bad habit, you also need to find a way to feel good about not doing it. You need to celebrate the restraint. Maybe you track the time you didn't waste on, say, scrolling social media, and you label that as productive free time. Make the doing nothing feel like a win.
Okay, that makes sense. But look, even with the best systems, everyone messes up sometimes, right? You miss a lead gen session, you skip a gym day. The core rule here seems to be never miss twice.
That's the absolute failsafe. The moment you slip up, that's actually less important than how quickly you get back on track. Missing once, okay, that's an accident. It happens. Missing twice, that's the start of a new negative pattern.
Right.
So you have to course correct immediately. Prevent that small slip from turning into a big slide down that compounding curve. The goal isn't perfection, it's consistency. Hashtag AC. Commitment versus interest, the 12-week year principle.
Okay, so moving from that daily consistency to, like, the bigger picture of execution, let's talk about this common trap in planning something called annualized thinking. It sounds like this psychological pitfall where because the deadline, the end of the year feels so far off, we just keep putting off the hard but important stuff. We tell ourselves, I've got 11 months left.
Annualized thinking is really dangerous for exactly that reason. It just kills any sense of urgency. But effective execution, that needs confrontation. You have to take that big, sprawling annual goal and squash it down into a shorter, much more intense window.
And that's the idea behind the 12-week year principle.
Exactly. By shrinking your planning cycle down to just 12 weeks instead of 52, you create immediate urgency. You're operating these intense 12-week sprints, not a leisurely year-long jog.
And I guess the beauty of that 12-week structure is you really can't afford to have more than 1 or 2 bad weeks without it being immediately obvious that you're failing.
Precisely. It forces you to face up to execution problems in week 3, not try to catch up in week 48 when it's way too late. And it fundamentally changes how you relate to discipline. Think about it. It's much easier to commit to doing something really tough for just 12 weeks than it is to commit to it for a whole year or, forever.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And that commitment, that's the difference between just being interested in something, which means you do it when it's convenient or fun, and being disciplined, which means you do the things you need to do, whether you feel like it or not. Success absolutely requires discipline.
So how does, say, a professional investor actually put this into practice in their week?
They need to stick to a really rigorous model work week. And this isn't just like a suggestion. It's a mandatory schedule where they block out specific time for the absolute mission-critical stuff.
Okay, like what?
Well, for an investor, maybe Mondays are totally dedicated to financial due diligence, analyzing deals. Tuesday mornings are block solid for lead generation and outreach. Friday mornings are maybe reserved for property walkthroughs or reviewing asset performance. The key is, the professional has to fiercely protect those time blocks from getting eaten up by distractions. There are non-negotiable commitments for that 12-week period. #2, financial due diligence and valuation and property acquisition.
All right, let's take that rigorous discipline and apply it to the number side of things now. We're shifting gears into finance. Real estate comes up again and again as this foundational way to build wealth. It acts as a really important hedge against, inflation and the dollar losing value.
Yeah, if you're serious about building lasting wealth through real estate,
Mhm.
the sources are pretty clear. You need three things. You need money, obviously. You need knowledge. And you need hustle. You need to put in the work. And your focus has got to be on buying real assets, things that actually generate income and go up in value, rather than liabilities that just suck up cash.
Yeah.
You're basically trying to engineer a situation where your money is working really hard for you instead of the other way around.
And that hard work, it pays off in 4 different ways, right? These often get talked about together. First, the most obvious one, cash flow. That's the profit you make each month after you pay all the bills.
Right.
Second is appreciation, and that's often split, isn't it?
Yeah.
There's market appreciation, the whole area goes up, and then there's forced appreciation, where you actively improve the property to make it worth more.
Exactly. Then number 3 is amortization. That's where your tenants' rent payments are actually paying down the principal balance on your loan over time. You're building equity without putting in extra cash. And then the fourth return, which can get pretty complex, is the tax shelter aspect. This is where savvy investors use depreciation, which is technically an expense on paper, even though no cash leaves your pocket to shield a chunk of their rental income from taxes.
Ah, okay.
So a deal that might look like it just breaks even based on actual cash flow could suddenly look really attractive once you factor in the tax benefits. But mastering that first one, cash flow, that remains the absolute fundamental skill separating good investments from risky bets. #, analyzing cash flow and deal quality.
Right. Let's nail down cash flow simply then. It's just the money left over each month after all the operating bills are paid. Like if you get $5,000 in rent and your total bills, mortgage, taxes, insurance, management, repairs are $4,000, you've got $1,000 in cash flow. Easy enough. But to figure out a property's real intrinsic value, especially for commercial stuff or multifamily buildings, we need a more universal number, right?
That's where the capitalization rate, or cap rate, comes in. The formula is net operating income, NOI, divided by the property's value or price. Now, crucially, NOI is the income after you've paid all the operating expenses, things like property management, taxes, insurance, utilities, repairs. Yeah.
But
before you account for your mortgage payment, your debt service.
Okay, so the mortgage payment doesn't factor into the cap rate itself. Why is that?
Well, because your mortgage is specific to your financing situation, right? How much you borrowed, your interest rate, that's personal to you, the investor. The NOI, on the other hand, reflects how the asset itself is performing, regardless of who loans it or how they financed it. That's why cap rate is so useful for comparing different properties.
Got it.
But the real power of the cap rate for an investor comes when you flip that formula around. Property value equals NOI divided by the cap rate demanded by the market. This tells you that the value of any income-producing property basically boils down to just two things: how much money it actually makes, the NOI, and the risk premium, or the required rate of return, that the market demands for that income stream, the cap rate.
Okay, and this is where that professional advantage really kicks in, right? Because a lot of newer investors fall into this trap, the bad deal trap, where they just assume a higher cap rate automatically means a better deal. Why is that often wrong?
Because a cap rate is just a snapshot. It's a yield right now. But income properties, you hold them for the long term, right? So let's imagine a scenario.
Yeah, lay it out for us.
Okay, property A. It's an older building, maybe in a market that's not really growing. It generates $80,000 a year in NOI, and it's priced at $1 million. That gives it an 8% cap rate. Looks pretty good on the surface, right? High immediate yield. But maybe its income is already maxed out. There's not much room to grow. Now, property B, similar building, but it's in a neighborhood that's really taken off, a high-growth area. It only generates $60,000 in NOI right now, and it's also priced at $1 million. So that's only a 6% cap rate. If you just look at the cap rate, property A seems way better.
But the smart money might be looking harder at property B, even with the lower starting cap rate. Why?
Because property B has rents that are way below market value. The savvy investor digs into the comps and realizes, hey, wait a minute. If I put maybe $50,000 into cosmetic stuff, new paint, updated kitchens, nicer landscaping, I could realistically push these rents up by 25% within a year.
Ah, forced appreciation.
Exactly. That forced appreciation could boost the NOI from $60,000 up to maybe $75,000, even $80,000. Now, in that high growth market, if the market cap rate for improved properties is still around, say 6%, or maybe even compressed a bit lower due to demand, that property's value hasn't just gone up by the $50 you spent. You might have forced the value up by $250,000 more.
Wow.
It completely blows property A out of the water in terms of long-term return. So you absolutely have to look beyond just the starting yield and really analyze the potential to increase that NOI. That's where the real value creation happens. Hashtag GNC. The spectrum of investment financing.
Okay, so once you've figured out if the deal itself is good, you need the money. And the sources pointed to a huge range of options for investors. You've got your standard conventional loans, government-backed ones like FHA or VA, bigger loans like jumbo or portfolio loans.
Right.
And then you get into the more alternative stuff, HELOCs, hard money, private financing, even owner financing.
Yeah, and the key is really matching the right financing tool to your specific investment strategy. For example, hard money lenders. They're almost essential if you're doing short-term, high-risk stuff like flipping houses.
Right, the quick in-and-out deals.
Exactly. These are usually private individuals or small companies. They can move really fast, which is great, but they charge pretty hefty fees and high interest rates, maybe 10, 12, even 15% sometimes, because the deal itself is inherently risky.
And what do these hard money guys need to see from the borrower to feel comfortable taking that risk? The sources mentioned they're really focused on the borrower having skin in the game.
Absolutely. They want to see that you, the borrower, have put a significant amount of your own cash into the deal up front. You need that vested monetary interest. Why? So that if the project hits a snag costs run over, the market dips, you're financially motivated to fix it and see it through, not just walk away and leave them holding the bag.
Makes sense. Their main protection is the property value, but the secondary protection is knowing you won't just bail.
Precisely. Now, on the other end of that private financing spectrum, you've got seller financing. This can actually be a really great win-win sometimes, especially maybe in niche markets or for unusual properties. Why would a seller want to do that?
That's a good question.
Well, it might let them get a higher sale price because they're essentially providing the financing service to the buyer. Plus, they get to earn interest on that loan, often at a better rate than they could get just sticking the money in a savings account.
Okay. And for the buyer?
For the buyer, it could be a lifesaver. Maybe they have slightly bruised credit, or maybe they're self-employed and have trouble documenting income in a way traditional banks like.
Yeah.
Seller financing can let them close a deal they just couldn't get done otherwise.
But the sources warned about a big risk here, especially if the seller still has a mortgage on the property. They talked about a wrap scenario. What's that, and why is it so dangerous?
Yeah, a wrap, or wraparound mortgage, is when the seller has an existing mortgage and they basically create a new loan for the buyer that wraps around the old one. The buyer pays the seller, and the seller keeps paying their original lender.
Okay. Sounds complicated.
It is, and it's risky because of something called the due-on-sale clause. This clause is standard in almost every conventional mortgage out there. It basically says that if the ownership of the property is transferred, the seller's original lender has the legal right to demand the entire remaining loan balance be paid back immediately.
Whoa. So the bank could just call the whole loan due?
Instantly, if they find out about the sale, which they often do through public records or insurance changes. So attempting a wrap when there's an underlying mortgage carries this huge risk of catastrophic default. Ideally, seller financing should really only be used on properties that the seller owns, free and clear, outright.
Yeah.
That takes the due-on-sale risk off the table. Hashtag #MakeAltAD. Warning signs of market distress, lessons from the bond market.
Now, to really grasp how some of these massive commercial real estate deals get valued, we actually need to look over at the financial markets that fund them. Specifically, the bond market and maybe some lessons learned or maybe not learned from the 2008 subprime crisis.
The parallels are definitely there, and they're pretty stark. Because what happens is valuation can stop being about the actual income the property generates
Right.
and start being almost entirely about how much debt is available to buy it.
Right.
During that subprime mess, you had investment banks creating these incredibly complex mortgage-backed securities, slicing and dicing risk into different layers or tranches. But the fatal flaw was what the sources called the illusion of rating.
Yeah, the sources mentioned that Wall Street firms were actually like gaming the models used by the rating agencies like Moody's and S&P.
Right.
How did that warp the pricing of risk?
Well, think about the riskiest pieces of these securities. The segments rated, say, triple B. They were supposed to be priced based on the actual risk of the underlying mortgages. But because the rating agencies had been sort of tricked or pressured into giving some pools of mortgages a better rating than they really deserved,
Uh-huh.
all the triple B tranches, regardless of the true quality of the loans inside them, started trading at roughly the same price, which meant, paradoxically, the bonds that were the most overpriced were precisely the ones that had been rated the most ineptly or deceptively. The valuation got completely disconnected from the actual underlying risk.
Wow. Okay. And we saw that exact same kind of dangerous dynamic play out in some huge iconic real estate deals too, right? Like
Yeah.
the sale of Stuyvesant Town Peter Cooper Village in Manhattan. That seemed like a case where the price was driven almost entirely by how much debt banks were willing to throw at it.
It's exactly right. When that massive apartment complex was sold at the peak of the market, the actual rental income it was generating at the time couldn't possibly cover the enormous debt payments the buyers took on.
So how did the price make any sense?
It didn't, based on current reality. The price wasn't determined by what the asset was actually earning. It was dictated purely by how much debt the investment banks were willing to lend. And that number was based on this highly speculative fantasy that rents could be jacked up super quickly and would just keep rising forever in a hot market.
So the price was basically set by the maximum leverage the banks would allow, not the sustainable net operating income.
Precisely. And that kind of exposure to risk, where your valuation relies entirely on future rapid income growth rather than current performance,
Yeah.
it's the same fundamental danger whether you're buying a $10 million strip mall or a $5 billion apartment complex. If the whole premise depends on hitting optimistic future projections, you are incredibly vulnerable to any kind of market shock or slowdown. #TriTag3, professional conduct and marketing clarity.
Okay, let's shift gears again. We've talked mindset, we've talked finance. Now let's move from those big financial risks to more interpersonal risks. We need to get into the human element, a professional's reputation, how clearly they communicate, and how well they understand negotiation psychology. These things often seem like the only barrier between success and, well, lawsuits or just deals falling apart. #A. The importance of reputation and trust.
Yeah, your professional reputation isn't just a feel-good thing. It actually acts like real financial leverage. The sources show evidence that having a reputation for being fair, for making win-win offers, can actively prevent conflicts from escalating.
How so?
Well, think about it. If the person on the other side of the table trusts your track record, if they know you operate in good faith, they're probably less likely to immediately jump to calling their lawyer if some minor issue pops up.
Yeah.
They're more willing to work it out because they trust you. That trust just smooths out and speeds up the entire process.
And that initial communication is so critical, isn't it? Especially if you're an investor making an offer that, requires the seller to maybe take a bit less than they hoped for. So the numbers work for you. You have to be upfront.
Transparency isn't optional there, it's mandatory. You absolutely have to communicate with respect, but also with honesty. Let the seller know straight up, look, I'm an investor. I have specific financial metrics my deals need to hit. For this to work, the numbers need to make sense for both of us.
Right.
You're not trying to pull a fast one or exploit them. You're trying to find that spot where it's mutually beneficial. Framing it that way can prevent that immediate defensive shutdown you might otherwise get. #B. Clarity and communication. It's sales psychology.
Okay, now if you're an agent or even an investor trying to market yourself or just explain your offer clearly, there's this golden rule that comes up, borrowed from the StoryBrand framework. If you confuse, you'll lose. It sounds simple, but in today's noisy world, your message absolutely has to be simple, relevant, and easy for the client to understand and repeat.
Complexity just creates confusion, and confusion breeds distrust and inaction. Think about someone selling their house. They aren't just looking for someone to handle the paperwork. That's the external problem, right? They're also dealing with an internal problem. Maybe they feel stressed or scared of making a bad financial decision or just anxious about the whole upheaval of moving.
Yeah, the emotional side.
Exactly. And then, critically, There's often a philosophical problem, too. Like, they believe selling a home should be an honest, straightforward process, but maybe they're worried it won't be.
Okay. So a truly successful professional, they position themselves or their service as the solution to all three of those levels.
That's the idea. You solve the practical transaction problem, external. You ease their anxiety and build their confidence, internal. And you affirm their belief that, yes, this can be done correctly and fairly, philosophical.
And how does that start? It sounds like it starts with really good communication skills.
Superior communication. Absolutely. A great salesperson or agent or negotiator doesn't just reply to what a client says. They listen carefully, process the underlying need, and then they respond thoughtfully. A really effective technique mentioned is to start conversations not with pressure or numbers, but with easy, open-ended questions. Questions designed just to build comfort and rapport. Like, so tell me a little bit about the house you're living in now, or what's the one thing you absolutely love about this neighborhood?
Why start with something so simple and positive like that?
Because it immediately lowers their guard. It gets them talking freely about themselves, about things they feel good about. That builds trust. And while they're talking, you're learning. You're picking up on their communication style, their priorities, what matters most to them, all before you even start talking about your commission or your investment criteria.
Right. So it's a patient approach. It avoids confusion and tries to replace their potential fear with confidence in you.
It's exactly. #tag. Negotiation tactics and psychological influence. Okay, now let's move from just building rapport to actual high-stakes bargaining. This is where understanding psychological tools becomes really crucial. And one of the most effective, maybe even counterintuitive tools discussed is the rejection then retreat technique. You might also know it as the door-in-the-face technique.
Yeah, I've heard of this. This is where you start by making some kind of extreme, really big request when
Yeah.
you fully expect them to reject, right?
Exactly. You know they're going to say no. But then you immediately follow it up with your actual, more moderate, reasonable request, the thing you wanted all along.
So what's the psychology behind why that works so well?
It triggers a powerful psychological principle called reciprocal concessions, or reciprocity. Because you made a concession by backing down from your initial extreme demand, the other person feels this subconscious obligation to meet your new, more reasonable requests with a concession of their own. It's like you did them a favor by lowering your demand, and now they feel they kind of owe you one.
And the sources pointed out something really fascinating about the results of using this tactic. It doesn't just lead to better, more profitable agreements for the person using it.
Right.
It also actually increases the other person's satisfaction with the deal and makes them feel more responsible for the final outcome. That seems weird.
It does seem weird, but it makes sense psychologically.
Yeah.
They genuinely feel like they successfully negotiated you down from some absurd starting point.
Yeah.
It makes them feel like they were a skilled bargainer, like they won something by getting you to back off. Yeah.
Okay. So they feel better about the deal because they think they drove a hard bargain.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And because they feel they played a key role in shaping the final agreement, they feel more committed to it, more responsible for making it work. It really shows that successful negotiation often isn't just about arguing over the price points on the surface. It's about understanding and managing those psychological currents flowing underneath.
And this kind of leads to another fundamental principle that seems to separate the real deal makers from the people who just waste time. The idea that yes is nothing without how.
Oh, absolutely critical. Anyone can shake hands and agree on a price? Yes, I'll pay that. Great. But if you don't immediately nail down the logistics, how is the due diligence period going to work? Exactly how and when will the earnest money be handled? What specific contingencies are deal breakers for each side? If you don't define the how, the whole agreement can just fall apart during the execution phase.
Right.
Skilled negotiators know this. They prioritize defining that precise path forward. They make sure everyone is crystal clear and aligned on the mechanics of how the deal gets done, not just on the initial agreement of yes.
Okay, now we need to take all this knowledge, the professional discipline, the financial savvy, the negotiation skills, and place it into a really necessary broader context. We have to understand the systemic forces, often rooted in history, that still influence property values, wealth creation, and even where people live in pretty much every market today. #tag. The legacy of institutional discrimination in housing.
Yeah, this is crucial context. And it's important to realize the idea of considering race and ethnicity when appraising real estate, that wasn't invented by the government. The sources show that real estate professionals themselves were already observing neighborhood demographics and baking those factors into property valuations way back in the 1920s.
So the bias existed before the government policies came along.
It did. What government policy did, particularly under the FHA, the Federal Housing Administration, wasn't necessarily to create the bias from scratch, but to codify it, systematize it, and enforce it on a massive national scale.
Let's talk about the FHA's role specifically, and that practice of redlining. The Homeowners Loan Corporation, the HOLC, created those infamous residential security maps with the color-coded neighborhoods.
Right, the red, yellow, blue, green maps.
And the FHA's mortgage insurance programs heavily favored areas that were rated second grade or B, the blue areas, often avoiding the highest rated A areas and definitely avoiding the C and D areas, which were often minority neighborhoods. And the sources stress that this wasn't accidental, it was done critically to actively preserve state-sponsored segregation.
That is the absolutely key insight here. The FHA's public mission was to make homeownership more accessible and secure loans. But behind the scenes, its underwriting manuals and practices actively worked to maintain racial segregation. For at least a decade, they found ways to get around or subvert Supreme Court rulings that were trying to outlaw housing discrimination.
Wow.
So they effectively ensured that the huge post-war suburbanization boom, which was largely fueled by easy FHA-backed mortgages, overwhelmingly benefited white families. Opportunities for African Americans and other minorities to buy homes in those new, appreciating suburbs and build wealth through housing equity were severely, systematically limited.
And the economic cost of that policy, the ripple effects, we're still feeling them today, aren't we? How did that deliberate segregation impact the ability of families to build wealth over generations?
It created enormous lasting disparities in wealth. When African Americans were shut out of getting those affordable FHA-backed loans for new homes in the suburbs, they were often forced to remain in older inner-city neighborhoods. These neighborhoods often required longer, more expensive commutes to the new job centers that were popping up in the suburbs. They typically paid higher rents for housing that was often lower quality and deteriorating. And crucially, they missed out entirely on the massive wave of property appreciation and generational wealth accumulation that families who did get those FHA loans in the suburbs enjoyed.
So it wasn't just about housing, it was about access to credit, access to appreciation, access to better schools and jobs.
It was a fundamental handicap to economic mobility that has echoed down through decades. The lack of access to affordable credit and the missed opportunity for appreciation created wealth gaps that persist today. #B. The economics of segregation and high rents.
Okay, this brings us to one of the most, frankly, astonishing and counterintuitive economic findings in the source material. It's this phenomenon called the slum premium, which basically suggests that historically, the absolute worst housing often costs the most to rent. That seems backwards.
It totally goes against basic supply and demand logic, doesn't it? Cheaper quality should mean cheaper rent. But the historical data is surprisingly clear on this. For example, back in New York City in the mid-1800s, when tenement buildings first really exploded, the rent in the most deplorable, overcrowded slums was actually about 30% higher than rent for similar size but better quality housing further uptown.
30% higher for worse conditions.
Yes. And, incredibly, even as late as 1960, studies in major northern cities found that black renters were paying demonstrably more per month than white renters for housing of comparable size and condition.
Why? That makes no sense from a pure quality perspective. If the housing is terrible, why on earth did it command a premium rent?
The key insight is this. Poor and marginalized populations, especially the black community, facing widespread discrimination, restrictive covenants, and social exclusion, didn't crowd into these slum neighborhoods because the housing there was cheap. They crowded in because those were often the only neighborhoods where they were allowed to live.
So the supply of permissible housing was artificially choked down to just a few areas.
Exactly. You had incredibly high demand chasing an extremely limited, artificially constrained supply. And basic economics tells you when demand massively outstrips supply like that, prices go up regardless of the actual quality of the goods, or in this case, the housing.
So the high rent wasn't reflecting the value of the apartment, it was reflecting the cost of the exclusion itself. It was like a tax on their limited choices.
Precisely. It was the price they paid for simply being allowed to exist in that location. And there's another layer, too. Landlords in these redlined or excluded neighborhoods often had much more lenient screening practices, not necessarily out of kindness, but because they had a captive market. This meant that problems like violence, drug activity, extreme poverty tended to concentrate heavily in these areas because other neighborhoods were actively screening out and banning both criminal records and signs of poverty. So the slum conditions were created or exacerbated by these dynamics, but the high rent was fundamentally a product of the systemic segregation limiting options. Hashtag C, zoning as an exclusionary tool.
And this whole systemic context, it feeds directly into how our towns and cities are planned, specifically through zoning laws. Now, early zoning, like the original Euclidean zoning, seemed to have a logical purpose, right? Separating incompatible land uses keeping the noisy factory away from the quiet residential street.
Right, that was the initial justification. But then, the rise of the automobile changed everything. Cars allowed people to live much further from where they worked, and zoning districts could become much larger and more spread out.
And that's when the focus of zoning started to shift
Yeah,
from just separating uses to something else.
it seems so. As these larger, more distant residential zones became possible, the focus subtly shifted from just controlling the type of use, residential versus industrial, to controlling the socioeconomic character of the neighborhood itself. This is where exclusionary zoning really started to take hold and flourish.
How did zoning get used as a tool for exclusion beyond just, say, banning apartment buildings in single-family neighborhoods?
Primarily by manipulating the physical requirements for what could be built. Municipalities started dramatically increasing things like minimum lot sizes, requiring houses to be built on an acre or more of land. They set minimum square footage requirements for the houses themselves, making small starter homes illegal. They mandated large setbacks from the road and property lines.
Ah, okay. So all these rules effectively jacked up the minimum cost of building a house in that area.
Exactly. They raised the cost of entry so high that entire classes of people, particularly working-class families, lower-income households, and often minority groups who faced additional economic barriers, simply could not afford to build a house that met the new expensive requirements. You couldn't build a small, affordable home on a small, affordable lot because it was illegal.
So the existing upper and middle class residents were essentially using zoning regulations to legally zone out poorer people to ensure their neighborhood stayed exclusive and composed only of homes similar in quality and price point to their own.
That appears to be the functional outcome, yes. It became a very powerful legally sanctioned tool for maintaining social and economic homogeneity, and arguably for preserving property values for the existing residents. Often this was done under justifications like maintaining community character or preventing overcrowding, but the exclusionary effect was undeniable.
And understanding how these zoning rules continued to restrict housing supply, make housing less affordable, and sometimes perpetuate segregation patterns today, that's essential knowledge for anyone working in the real estate world, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's part of that deep systemic context you have to grasp. Hashtag tag outro.
Wow. We have covered an incredible amount of ground today. I mean, we went from the absolute micro-level systems of getting just 1% better every single day and mastering the psychology of something like the rejection then retreat negotiation tactic, all the way up to the huge macro financial lessons from the bond market collapse, and then into the really difficult, complex history of institutional discrimination and redlining in housing.
Yeah, and the connecting thread, the thing that ties all these seemingly disparate pieces together, is the absolute critical importance of having an information advantage. In real estate, being truly successful, it means you have to look way beyond just the contract details or the current market stats. It requires understanding that exponential power of disciplined daily habits. It requires being able to assess a property's real value based on its intrinsic income, its NOI, and the associated risk, not just based on how much leverage a bank is willing to give you.
Right.
And crucially, it demands a deep understanding of those historical forces, those psychological currents, those systemic issues like zoning and segregation that are still shaping every single neighborhood and every transaction today.
Yeah, we really took this stack of sources that on the surface seem to be about totally different things, personal growth, high finance, social justice. And we found that they all actually contribute to building this profile of a truly successful professional, someone who not only executes the deal mechanics flawlessly, but also understands the immense, complex web of forces that define both opportunity and risk in real estate.
And maybe we can leave you, the listener, with this final provocative thought to kind of chew on, building directly on that slum premium idea we discussed. If we know that historically these segregated, often run-down, low-income areas frequently commanded higher rents than comparable white neighborhoods, what does that strange historical fact tell you about the true non-monetary value, or maybe the hidden financial cost that might still be embedded, perhaps invisibly, in the price and the rent of every single piece of real estate you look at today?
That is a powerful question to end on, something to definitely think about. Thank you for diving deep with us today. We'll see you next time.